Today we're going to try and answer the question that plagues so many quilt pattern writers out there, and that is how much is too much when it comes to colorways, sizes, different quilt variations that you can have in a single pattern. We, of course, always want to give the reader options, and so it's really nice to have alternate colorways, alternate sizes, right? Multiple sizes that they can make, but there is a point where you have too many of those in a pattern and it just becomes too much. It's too confusing, too much going on. The pattern ends up 25, 30 pages long. It's just too much for a single pattern. And so today we're going to kind of talk about where that cutoff is and when you might want to kind of split it into an original pattern and then pattern extension, which is a really great way to kind of keep those variations and keep that creativity that you had when you were designing the pattern without overwhelming your audience. So a really good indicator that you maybe are including too much in a single pattern is when you have more than two sets of complicated cutting instructions. So a lot of times you'll see patterns that have multiple colorway variations, right? So you might have like a black and white version, a 2-color version, and then the traditional original design that might have like 4 or 5 colors, and then you've got like fat quarter version, a pre-cut version, like all of these different versions, right? Every time you change the kind of the colorway or the variation of the pattern, you're going to have to include another set of cutting instructions. Sometimes you can manage this by having basically all of the background cuts being the same, and then it's just kind of the feature fabric cuts that change a little bit. But if you've got really super complicated cutting instructions and you've got more than 2 sets of those in a pattern, that's a really good indicator that it's time to split that pattern up or get rid of one of those variations. And so what do you do with the other variations, right? Say you've just been super creative and you've got so many ideas that you can do with this design. That's great. That doesn't mean like don't do those and just toss them out. But what you can do is basically launch the original pattern with just 1 or 2 variations, right? Keep it short, sweet, and to the point. And then 3 months down the line, or even during your launch period, you've launched the pattern, you're like a week or 2 in, buzz is starting to die down a little bit. That's where you can kind of surprise drop that alternate variation or pattern extension that has these additional variations within it. That's a really good way to do it. But I find when I'm reading patterns that if you've got like 4 or 5 pages of cutting instructions, because there's so many different variations, it just gets to the point where it's too much. So 2 is kind of that cutoff. You can have 2 fairly intricate different cutting variations. That's fine, but don't go to like 3, 4, 5. That's too much. Another really good indicator that you've included too much in one pattern is if you've got 2 different sets of instructions. So what I mean by that is you kind of have the process for going through it for making one of the variations, and you've basically got a whole second pattern tacked onto the end for constructing the alternate variation, because the instructions and the process for assembling those 2 designs are completely different. Those are 2 different quilt patterns. Split them apart and sell them as 2 different quilt patterns. It's like a 2-for-1, right? So if you find yourself doing that, and this happens a lot with like medallion style quilts, or if you've got basically like 1 size of block and then you scale it up and do 2 sizes of block, and that involves some different assembly instruction methods, things along those lines, or if you've got like a really intricate colorway and a really simplified colorway, and you've combined some of the pieces on the simplified colorway so that you're not assembling those 2 different blocks in the same ways with the same kind of base pieces. Those are 2 different patterns. Split them apart. Don't try and combine it into one pattern. It just makes a nightmare for your reader. Those patterns are really hard to read. And so likewise, one way to kind of manage that variation is to make sure that if you've got different colorways, make sure they assemble the same ways, right? So if you've got different pieces, label those different kind of colored pieces with the same labels so that in the instructions you can just say, grab a rectangle A. And it doesn't matter if that rectangle A is from your feature fabric, if it's a 2-color version, or fabric B, if it's a 4-color version. It's the same piece and the same instruction regardless of the colorway you're working from. That is a really good way to kind of simplify these versions that have multiple colorway variations. Another thing that can kind of become too much in a single pattern is if you've got multiple block sizes. So what I mean by this is you have an option for like a 4-inch block, and then you have an option for an 8-inch block and a 10-inch block. That's great if it's a block pattern, right? It's just a single block as part of like a bundle or a sew along or something like that. Like, go for it. Multiple block sizes are great. But if you're writing an actual quilt pattern with it, and you've got like a baby size that you can either do with like a 4-inch or an 8-inch block to get a different effect, if those blocks are not just like simple half square triangles, that's really hard to manage, right? Because now your kind of intermediate piece dimensions are different depending on which colorway you're working with. And then if you have multiple sizes on top of that, it's too much, right? So try to limit your patterns to having just one block size if it is actually a quilt pattern and you've got multiple sizes included in there. If you are making the quilt and you go, wow, if I just kind of scaled this up a little bit and did like a giant block size, it would make such a cool design. Again, drop that into a pattern extension, sell it for $2, $3 as an add-on. Really great way to do it, and also make a little extra cash. Don't see it as like trying to extract more money from your customers is not what we're doing here. You're actually helping the customer by keeping that original pattern simpler and easier to read, so it's a better experience for them. And then if they're really interested and they love that kind of scaled up block pattern, they can go for the extension, no worries. The last kind of really great indicator that it's time to start kind of pulling things out of your quilt pattern to simplify it a little bit is when you are trying to use multiple pre-cut types. So pre-cut types are layer cakes, which are 10-inch squares, charm packs, 5-inch squares, and generally fat quarters, fat ace, or jelly rolls, which are 2.5-inch strips. So some of those are kind of interchangeable, right? A fat eighth and a fat quarter aren't that different, especially if you're kind of only using half of the fat quarter in the first place. And likewise with layer cakes and charm squares, right? A charm square is just a layer cake cut into 4 pieces. And so if you're using them in that way, it's a fairly interchangeable process, and so that's okay. But I've seen some patterns that will try to incorporate both layer cake squares and jelly rolls at the same time. And the way that you get to your pieces from those two very different pre-cuts is a very, very different path, right? In the layer cake, you might be cutting strips or squares from those. From the jelly roll, you're taking strips and sorting things differently. It's a different beast altogether. And so you may end up in the same spot, but you're taking two completely different paths to get there. And this kind of comes back to that 2 different sets of instructions that we talked about earlier. If you've got 2 completely different paths to get to the design that you're trying to make, that's too much for one pattern. Pick one or the other and go with it. And again, if you really fall in love with that design, you really want to make that an option to your customers, put it in a pattern extension. It's a great way to kind of keep the original pattern simplified and easy to read without kind of disrupting your customer's experience while still giving them the options that you really want to include. Now, what we didn't talk about are just multiple sizes and how many sizes are too many sizes. This is one that can kind of go either way, which is why it's not on this list. So if you've got a repeating block pattern where you're just adding more blocks and more rows, have at it. Do as many sizes as you want. I regularly publish pattern with 6 sizes, right? Because all of the instructions are the same. The cutting instructions are the only thing that varies. We're not really adding length or complexity to the pattern. You're just having to make your cutting table a little bit bigger. That's totally fine. If, on the other hand, we're talking about a medallion style quilt where the aspect ratio is kind of changing, and so you're not just taking one base shape and design and assembly method and just enlarging it. You're having to add borders, you're having to add different pieces, you're having to kind of enlarge the design as you go. That's where maybe you want to limit it to like 3 sizes. That's a good number, right? 3 sizes for a medallion quilt is still a tricky right? Like that's a lot of math. That's a lot of things to kind of manage. Any more than that, and it's like way too much, but feel free with a medallion style quilt to also just keep it very simple at 1 size. That's also totally fine. You will always get people that kind of complain, why don't you have a bed size? This is only a baby size or a throw size. Like, I want to make a bed size. How do I do this, right? That's fine. Let them ask those questions. Nobody is ever going to be 100% happy. It's just the nature of being a business. You're always going to have some people who complain. If that is such a frequent question that keeps popping up, again, you can also make the option of adding like an intricate border add-on to your pattern later if you're frequently getting this question of like, how do I enlarge this medallion style quilt and make it a bed size? I really want a bed size in this quilt. Write an extension for it and charge $5 or $6 for that, because that's going to be a fairly intricate pattern that kind of extends the original. Bundle them together, sell it together, get a little bit more mileage out of that pattern, but don't let the complainers deter you because they're always going to be there. Alrighty, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you next week for Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya.